The topic of this tape is why believe your thoughts. And this thought came to me many years ago. I'm sure, like me, you were brought up in a family that taught you to have certain beliefs, ways of acting, living your life. And probably you were brought up not knowingly, but the message was whatever's in your mind is part of you, therefore you must believe it. And so as we get older, whatever comes into our mind, we tend to believe it. And having worked in the field of the yoga philosophy, the vision of oneness, and doing the work of meditation, I've really come to see that because a thought is in my mind doesn't necessarily mean that I need to believe it. So I sit here now and I want to share some thoughts with you, and hopefully they'll spark you to think a little bit. And that's really what I'd like you to do. I would like you to sit back for a moment and really look at your mind and look at the thoughts that come into your mind and notice how there's someone sitting back there observing the mind, observing the thoughts. And in fact, we do have the power to decide if we want to act on a thought or not. We do have the power at any given moment to observe a thought and decide if that is our truth. So we start off with a basic question. And the question has been asked many times, who am I? So we're starting off sitting here, listening to the tape, thinking about what's being said, but who is that person? Who is the person who's sitting and thinking? Who is the person who's sitting and noticing? Who is the one who observes your whole life? So right now, if I asked you, you could think about yourself as a child. And then I could ask you, well, what was it like in high school? And then ask you questions about, well, what was it like when you were in college if you went? And each of you would have an idea that would come into your mind, a memory. You'd have an awareness. So here you were as a child, and right now you can remember parts of that life. And then you were a youngster, and you can remember that, and a teenager, and a young adult. Who was the person who was present, even though the body was young and now the body's older? And at one point you had certain thoughts in your mind. Let's say maybe even this week at some point you were disturbed. Another time during the week you were happy. Who is that person who knows that? That's our starting point. So the philosophy of oneness, the Vedanta philosophy, teaches us that there is a being within us. And that being is not a mental being. And that being is not a physical being. That being is awareness. And so the I that we're speaking about is what is called the observer self, the knower self. And it's that part of us that is always alert. It's always awake. It's always living in a state of freedom. Never is it bound. That I is where we place our attention. That's the starting point. So as awareness, we are always free. Now, certainly in my life, I know there are times when I don't experience freedom. So what happens then? What's going on that I don't experience freedom? Right? So something, as I observe it, something happens within my mind. Something occurs inside my head. My mind thinks some thought, whatever that thought might be. And I put my attention on it. And I become that thought. And then I get disturbed. But throughout it all, there's still a part of me which is just watching, is just observing. So the I that we're speaking about, that's where we want to place our attention. That I am state, that pure consciousness state. So within all people, every single person, there is a reality, there is a dimension which is blissful, is awake, is aware, and is always in a state of observing. Now, what does it observe? It observes whatever the mind is doing, and it observes whatever the body's doing. But that observing part That knower self, we call it also, is present within everyone. So the thought that I would like to start the tape off with is the thought that we are not our thoughts, that there's someone else there. Now, this was a very radical thought when I first heard it. I liked it. There was something about it that attracted me, absolutely. But the thought that I was more than what was on my mind, especially the condition of my mind at the time, I was very happy to find that out. So I would like you to think about that. That just because a thought comes into your mind doesn't necessarily mean, number one, that it's the truth, and number two, nor does it have to be acted on. Now, certainly as we grow older and we learn about self-control and we learn about self-discipline, we realize that because my mind may say after a delicious meal that it wants to have a huge dessert, and my stomach really doesn't want it, I can listen to that thought and say, no, I'm sorry, but I don't think I'm going to act on that. For some people, though, they don't have that power. If a thought comes in the mind that says, I want dessert, well, immediately then the dessert is probably in the mouth and in the belly before you can even breathe a second breath. So the thought is, I am that being. I am that consciousness. I am that awareness. I am more than just a physical body, and I'm much more than the thoughts in my mind. So we introduce then the thought that consciousness is who I am. Awareness is who I am. That consciousness and that awareness certainly enters into the mind, certainly creates thoughts and perceptions and ideas. But it's important to know that that's not who I am. I am the one who is the observer of the mind. That's the first basic tenet. And it's very important to go into that. I am not saying that you are not the mind. I'm saying you are greater than the mind. I'm not saying you don't have a mind. Of course, we all have minds. We all have thoughts, emotions, and beliefs. However, we are the ones who are in power. We are the masters of the mind. We are the observers of the mind. And the thoughts that go into the mind, the thoughts that the mind creates and produces, aren't always necessarily the truth, nor are they necessarily the thoughts that we want to live by. And until we begin to recognize that I am more than that I exist as awareness, as a conscious being who uses the mind, I will not be free. And as I grew into this understanding, I began to realize that every human being wants to be free. They want to experience some state of expansion, of peace, some state of blissfulness. And if you look at your life, I'm sure you'll find that you also want that. Then we come into a very important point, which is what can we do in order to experience that peacefulness? What is it that we need to do in order to live a conscious, awake life where we can feel good about ourselves? In order to do that, we have to realize where the peace, where the happiness, and where that bliss lies. For many of us, we were taught at a very young age that if you live a certain life, let's say if you get a job, a certain type of job, earning so much money, if you have a certain type of relationship, if you have a partner in your life, then you'll be happy. And then you might have also learned that if you got a certain education, were able to perform at a certain level of intelligence, then you'll be happy. But for those of us who have been really observing and studying in this field of meditation, we found that that's not necessarily the truth. Certainly it's wonderful to have a partner that you love. Certainly having financial security is wonderful. Certainly having an intelligence present to you so that you can live your life in a state where you can interact and enjoy yourself is great. But that does not necessarily bring you to a state of oneness. It doesn't necessarily give you what you're looking for. So what we're finding out is that the awareness that we bring to our life, the awareness that we bring to our mind, that is what we've all been looking for. The peace, The joy and the happiness that every human being is looking for is their own true nature. It's who they are. They have always been that, and they will always be that. It's the part of them that never changes. And as we said earlier on, that when you were young, who was there? Who was present so that right now you can remember yourself as a youngster? And who was present when you were a teenager? It wasn't the body, it wasn't that mind, because that's changed dramatically, I'm sure, since back then. But you can remember that. So there was an awareness present. There always has been an awareness present within you. That's where we place our attention. We place our attention not so much on the contents within the mind, but we place our attention on the being and the awareness that enters into that mind. Now, I know this is a completely different way of looking at it. This is not something that we were taught in school. This isn't something that even probably our philosophy classes we learned in college. But it's a very important point. Because unless you understand that you exist always in freedom, that you exist as consciousness, you exist as a wise being. I think of that statement that Jesus made when he said, "I and the Father am one." And unfortunately, many people interpret that to believe that it was the body, Jesus, and the personality, Jesus, that he was speaking of. And I firmly believe that, in fact, he wasn't speaking of that. He was speaking of the I amness. He was speaking of the consciousness that he was. So he wasn't speaking about his thoughts and his personality and his physical body. He was speaking of that consciousness that he knew he was. And that consciousness is always one with God. That's a very, very powerful statement to make. Because he was convinced, I'm sure, that the contents of his mind was not who he was. He knew he was more than that. So in the same way, through meditation and through understanding what the mind is, through understanding who is the self, who are you? I mean, I know you've probably heard that statement before, but think of it for a moment. Who am I? Am I this personality? Am I this person speaking right now? Or am I the conscious being who is aware that I'm speaking? Who's aware of what I'm saying? Who's aware of the friends who are sitting in front of me, listening up to the tape? So it means a shift in the way we think. It means a shift in the way we understand ourselves. If you're not knowing that you are an aware being, if you're not knowing that you exist in a dimension, on a level that is beyond the mind, that you exist as a conscious being, and then you enter into this mind and you gather together thoughts and beliefs and ideas and concepts, and we call that your personality. So in this philosophy, there's an understanding that your mind is a vehicle, or it's an instrument. It is an instrument in the same way that a pen is an instrument that you use to write. So you pick up the pen and you write. So you may write a letter to a friend and you say, "Dear friend, I'm so happy that I have an opportunity to communicate with you, and I want to let you know how much I love you." The friend doesn't call you up on the phone and say, "I want to tell this pen how much I'm grateful and thankful for that statement." The friend comes right to the source. It comes to you. And it says, "Thank you for writing such a beautiful letter. I appreciate it." And of course, the opposite is also true. If you're in a little bit of a depressed state and you write a letter to someone and you may not be so loving and nice, they don't write back or call you up on the phone and say, "Gee, that wasn't a nice letter, pen." They don't discuss it to the pen. They go right to the source and they say, "Gee, you must have not been feeling so well to write a letter like that." In the same way, your mind is an instrument. You use it. You are the power. You are the consciousness. You are the awareness. You are the intelligence. And you bring that to your mind. So then you use your mind in order to communicate, in order to gather information, in order to conceptualize, in order to write poetry, in order to write love letters. You use the mind because it's an instrument that allows you to communicate with others. But the mind is not who you are. Think about that for a moment. It's a new thought for many, I'm sure. But do you know that you are a very wonderful being? And depending on what's in your mind, you will either experience that or not. For example, if you just take the hypothesis that you are consciousness, you are awareness, you are a free being, infinitely pure. If you take that thought and then think for a second, well, why is it sometimes I suffer? If in fact it's true that I am a conscious being, well, how come I suffer then? Well, we can take this another step now. If in the contents of the mind there are disturbing thoughts, when you, the conscious being, enter into that instrument or vehicle, just like you sit in a car, so you enter into the mind, and if the mind is filled with negative thoughts, unless you are very aware, you will probably get caught up in those negative thoughts. For example, all of us have different happenings in our life where we get disturbed. And then maybe one day we work with someone and they help us step back from it and observe it and say, well, look at that. I don't have to get disturbed by that. What I can do is I can remain myself even when those thoughts are in my mind. That's what we're talking about. Through the practice of meditation and through understanding this philosophy, you come to know that whatever is in your mind are just passing waves. Now, those passing waves have nothing to do with you. So imagine you're sitting on a beach, and one of those airplanes go by that are dragging a sign behind it, right? Advertising. And it's dragging, and the sign says, "You are not a good person." Be a horrible sign to put on a plane, but let's just imagine it happened. Here you are sitting on the beach looking up at that sign. Now, is anyone going to get disturbed by that? Hopefully not. If you recognize that you're okay and you're sitting on the beach and you're observing that passing wave of a sign, there's no problem. If you forget, if you forget that you're the one that's sitting on the beach looking at the sign, and you take that sign and you bring it inside you, and you live that feeling that I'm not a good person, then you get disturbed. So depending on the different thoughts that are in your mind, and depending on how aware you are, do you know that the thoughts in the mind have nothing to do with you? They're just waves, passing waves in the mind. Once you know that, you're able to step back from it. You're able to look at it in an entirely different way. Then you know that you are the one who can choose whatever thoughts you want to choose. Granted, that's an advanced state, but in actuality it can be attained very quickly once you understand the basic premise. So the first point to remember is, I am awareness. I am consciousness. I am always connected to that higher power. I don't exist as an individual merely experiencing loneliness and separation. That I am always connected to a place inside of me that allows me to experience fulfillment and satisfaction and joy and love, no matter what is happening on the level of the mind. This is the first step. The second point to remember then is that your mind, in fact, is a vehicle that you use. So you get into a car, you drive your car to the destination, and then you get out of the car. Well, in the same way, we wake up in the morning, and we leave that blessed state we were in during the night. We come into the mind, which we call the waking state. And when we enter into the mind, just like you enter into a car, you then begin to think. You then begin to perceive. You then begin to use the mind. If you remain aware and if you remain awake, no matter what's going on in the mind, you realize that is a functioning of the mind, but not you. That definitely will help you. Now, there are techniques that'll help you to step back from your thoughts and recognize your thoughts and look at your thoughts. But what we're doing on this tape, in this program, is we're beginning to think about our mind in a completely different way. So because you have a thought in your mind, you no longer have to believe it. You can step back and realize it's just a passing wave. But let me warn you of something. The mind is very convincing. When the mind thinks something, it's got a great publicity team. And they have a way of convincing you absolutely that whatever's in your mind is the truth. That's the nature of the mind. So unless you've practiced in being able to step back and observe your thoughts, recognize what thoughts are in your mind, you probably will believe whatever it is that's in your mind at any given time. Then that creates a lot of problems. So as we begin to develop a new understanding about this mind, we also then have the potential to establish a new relationship with the mind. For most people, they haven't had the opportunity to really think about this. They haven't been exposed to this way of looking at it. So for most people, whatever the mind thinks, whatever comes up emotionally, whatever they feel, as they say, the gut feeling, they believe it to be true. That's the basic problem with human nature, that we've been trained to believe everything that comes into our mind to be true. And we've practiced that for so long that it's a new idea, and it's going to take some time and some practice to be able to change that tendency. But because you think something, it doesn't mean it's true. Because you feel something, now I'm really getting into an area that can be tricky. Because in the 70s, we were taught, follow your feelings. If you feel something, it must be true, and go with it. But yet, if we step back now and realize feelings are an outcome of what's in your mind. Emotions are a part of what is going on, how you think, how you organize yourself. So just because you feel something, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is the truth. Just because you have some type of a gut feeling about something doesn't mean it's accurate. There's another part of us that needs to be awakened and stimulated, and that's the part we call the observer self. The part of you that is always watching, the part of you that's alert, intelligent, aware, and wise. This is not the part of you that's within your mind. This is the part of you that we're calling the conscious part of you, the self, the I am state. So there is part of you that does know. There's no doubt about that. However, by the time the mind gets a hold of some information and turns it and changes it and slants it and colors it, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to represent the truth. As a matter of fact, for most people, very seldom does it represent the truth. It just becomes another experience that they're having, which is colored by their own belief system. So we have to then begin to practice some techniques, put some time in, so that we can get in touch with this wise part of ourself. It's important that we take some time to practice observing thoughts, because you're hearing it, and many of you might be agreeing with it. However, this is just a theory. So when I say to you, why are you believing your thoughts? Yeah, you stop for a moment, you look at that and say, well, that's an interesting thought. Why believe my thoughts? Because it's my thoughts. Therefore, it has to be right. And now all of a sudden you're hearing someone say, wait a second now, you might want to question that. I remember when I was growing up and was a hippie back in the 70s, the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, we had a great slogan that was on our bumpers of our cars, which was question authority. Just because someone says it's true, that doesn't mean you should believe it. If a politician says something, thank goodness now we're all, developed enough to know that that doesn't necessarily mean it's the truth. Well, in the same way where we used to say question authority, question your mind. Bring in awareness, discrimination. Let the intelligence that's within you question the mind and see if in fact that's a thought you want to live with, if that's a belief you want to hold true in your life. But in order to do that, you have to awaken the part of you which can step back from the thoughts and witness and look at the thoughts. So even right now, let's practice an exercise which will help you to understand what this is about. So as you're listening to the tape, just close your eyes for a moment and take a few slow, deep breaths. So breathe in deeply through the nose, and then as slowly as possible, breathe out through the nose. So breathing in and slowly breathing out. It'll take about 5 or 6 of these breaths to allow you to go into a meditative state of consciousness. So breathing in and then very slowly breathing out. Now, as you do this, observe your breath. Notice the body taking deep breaths. And as you observe the breath going in and out, notice if there are any passing thoughts. We mentioned those before, passing waves. So observe that. Notice, observe the breath, and notice if there are any thoughts in your mind. Now, as you concentrate on the breath, your mind is beginning to become calm. There may be many thoughts that pass through it, many waves that pass by. Yet, because you're concentrating on the rhythmical, relaxing flow of your breath, automatically your mind is beginning to slow down. Now, this is a very important step. The calmer the mind, the more relaxed the body, the more you will begin to be aware of the part of you which exists free from the mind and free from the body. So breath is flowing. Notice how your shoulders are dropping. Notice how your belly, your abdomen is softening. Notice how your jaw is relaxed. Have your teeth apart and your lips touching as you continue to breathe in and out through the nose. Now your thoughts are becoming less frequent. So be in touch with the part of you which is observing your breath. This takes some concentration now. This isn't that easy. Notice that there's a part of you which is sitting back, observing the thoughts in the mind, observing the movement of the breath, and it's uninvolved with it all. This is what we call awareness, consciousness. self. This is the part of you which is always connected to that higher power, always connected to God. This completes side A. When you're ready, you can turn over to side B.